Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks all for coming along this evening. My name's Helen Scales. I am a marine biologist, and in case any of you don't know me already and are perhaps wondering, it is my real name. But I'm not the only marine biologist who does have a good name. Here's a couple of my favourites. Here's Teddy Gill. He was an American ichthyologist, a fish biologist in the 19th century. There's this chap, Steve Haddock. He studies jellyfish, as you can see from his T-shirt. He's still around. He's another American. And I think my absolute favourite marine biologist with a good name is this lady, Moray Fish. And we're going to come back to her a bit later. She was also American, was doing some really interesting stuff in the 1950s. So, yes, so I am here today to talk to you about fish and the blue parts of our planet. As we've already heard, 70% of our planet is covered in water. We certainly do live on a blue planet. If we look at it from space, that becomes really quite obvious. And in fact, if we consider that the average depth of the oceans is about 4 kilometers, add all that water up, and it creates, without doubt, the biggest living space on the planet, the biggest piece of our biosphere. The space for the crawling, living things in our life, swimming beasts, have about 90% of the space for them to live in is the oceans. And reigning supreme, I will argue, in this wonderful, huge space are the fish. I didn't bring any fish with me this evening. I did think about bringing an aquarium along with me to introduce some of these beasties, but that didn't really work out. So instead, what I want to do is take you on a virtual journey to meet some of the denizens of the deep and to find out that really there's an awful lot going on in the lives of fish, perhaps more than you might ever imagine. Because for starters, fish are extraordinarily diverse. We think there's about 30,000 species of them alive today, and that means that they're basically, for every other vertebrate on the planet, fish are vertebrates, they have backbones. There's one fish for one of everything else. So the mammals, the birds, the reptiles, the amphibians, about 30,000, and then about 30,000 fish. So there's an awful lot of fish, and they come in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and they get up to some pretty amazing things. Things like, well, here we have the Greenland shark, an enormous great big shark. I think it would only just about fit on this stage here. They're meant to be about 7-8 meters long, I think. They live in the Arctic under the sea ice. Their hearts beat 5 times a minute. They occasionally emerge to the surface to apparently feast on polar bears, maybe the occasional unfortunate moose. Amazing beasts. But really the most extraordinary thing about these fish is that recently it was uncovered that they can live for 500 years. They found this out by actually looking at traces of radioactivity in their eyes. There was a pulse of radioactivity put into the ocean in the 50s when they were testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific. And this is a timestamp that we can now see filtering through ecosystems in the oceans and including in these sharks. And that's how they've kind of worked it backwards. And we think there's quite a range, but we think that certainly some of them could live for 500 years. So that makes them the longest lived vertebrates on the planet, which is pretty cool. They aren't all big, though. This is the world's smallest fish. Doesn't even have a common name, so we have to go with Pedicrypsis progenetica. They live in the swamps of Borneo. This is a fully grown individual. They only live for a few weeks. They were the world's smallest vertebrate for a while until a really tiny frog was discovered fairly recently, and now that's the smallest one. So maybe the world's second smallest vertebrate. So that's pretty awesome. Fish get up to some incredible things that science is revealing to us more and more with some of the extraordinary tools we have available to show some of the feats that these things undergo. So one of my favorite examples is the wonderful bluefin tuna. Maybe only really that well known amongst sushi aficionados. They are a very highly prized species for sushi trade. But they get up to some incredible things. And so we now have satellite tags that can be fixed on individual fish. These guys are quite big, so they can take a reasonably sized pinger, which basically sends off messages to satellites to show where they are when they reach the surface, logging their journeys. And it's revealed that they do some extraordinary things. So these fish are born off the coast of Japan over here. This is where the spawning takes place. And their feeding grounds, unfortunately, inconveniently, are over here in California. So the satellite tags have shown us that the fish swim across there to go and feed. And then when it's time for them to spawn, they go back again. And there was one fish in particular that was tagged, and throughout the course of 20 months, it swam from Japan to California, back to Japan and back to California. So it swam 40,000 kilometers, which is the same as the circumference of the planet in 20 months. So amazing feats of migration. These fish aren't just wandering randomly around. They know how to find what they need, where they're spawning, where they're feeding. They're navigating in ways we're still trying to understand. Probably maybe they're using magnetic sensors, possibly the sun, the stars, currents, all sorts of things that they're sensitive to. So fish do get up to some amazing things, and some of them, a lot of them actually, are undergoing huge journeys through the seas. But not all of them. Some of them stay put and don't really move very far at all. And I want to show you a little video now that I shot while I was snorkeling just recently in Fiji. And let's see if I can get this going. Let's try again. There we go. Ooh, there we go. So originally I was actually interested in this fish here, this lovely colourful chap here with the stripes. I'm not a particularly good videographer, so I should probably apologise for the camera shake. It's more just to remind me what I saw, and there were lots of lovely fish swimming around, and I thought, well, that's all very nice. And then I realised there's another fish in this picture that I hadn't originally spotted. And I don't know if any of you can see that there is a fish that isn't black and white, it's not yellow, it's hiding down here. And once I saw this, I definitely gave myself a high five on the fish spotting stakes, because they are really, really hard to see. It's a stonefish. So I got in closer and took another shot. There is a fish in this picture. If you don't believe me, I'll give you a clue. There is an eye in there. It's a bit shady, so it's hard to see. And its mouth is there, grumpy mouth. Stonefish really are these extraordinary masters of disguise. They have evolved to be able to change the colour of their skin, the texture of their skin, and they are ambush predators. Their idea of how to get a meal is to sit tight, not move, pretend it's not there at all, hide itself as a piece of weedy rock or a piece of reef, and wait for food to come close enough. I didn't see it eating one of those fish when I was watching it, but I suspect that might have happened fairly soon after I left. So there are fish that really don't move, but they have other ways of surviving and being incredibly successful in this underwater world. And really, one of the things I want to talk about tonight and get across to you is this idea of the extraordinary lives of fish that really go underappreciated out here on land. We don't see beneath this blue blanket of the oceans. We don't see what's going on. And it's hard to appreciate some of the nuanced behaviours that have evolved and extraordinary things that they get up to. Really, fish are typecast as smelly, slimy, boring, cold-hearted creatures that we really can't get to know. Either that or fish are simply food, and it's incredibly hard to have any kind of relationship with something that we eat in the first place, let alone if it's a pile of fish fingers on your plate or a can that has chicken on the label. So really there are these barriers, I feel, between us and fish and appreciating them as wildlife, as creatures that have evolved wonderful lives. And there are also various myths about fish that I think add a further barrier to our understanding, and I want to bust a few of those this evening. The first one, has anyone heard of this, the idea that fish have got 3-second memory? Or 7 seconds sometimes, it's called. A goldfish can remember for 7 seconds. And this is a really persistent idea, even within scientific circles, that fish don't have the ability to remember for very long, maybe not as short as 3 seconds, but certainly they're not very well endowed in the brain department. And it's really taken a long time to chip away at this reputation and to try and find studies that really get to grips and understand more about the cognition and the abilities of fish. But we are gathering examples that really show that there's extraordinary things going on in their brains, and they can remember things for quite a bit longer than that. One of my favourite examples for that is the frill Fin Goby. Now, this little fish lives on the coast of Mexico in the rocky shores at the edge of the sea. Not particularly anything exciting to look at, but it has got an amazing ability to escape from danger. And what they do is, and I haven't got any video footage of this, but I've got some, I did some very high-tech animations for you tonight to explain how this works. So we've got our little goby here in blue and a predator, an octopus here. This is the shoreline, and this is obviously the surface of the sea. Now, what happens when this fish, when the tide is high, the little gobies swim around their piece of the rocky shore, and they memorize the shape of the seabed. They're looking at where there are lumps and bumps, and they're working out where pools will form when the tide goes down, and mapping out their environment. So if we now have the tide going out, it's coming down here, because what they don't want is to be trapped in a tide pool with a predator. This is pretty bad news for them. So what do? They jump to safety. But they don't just randomly jump anywhere they go, because they could end up jumping somewhere they don't want to be. Over here is no good at all. They jump in exactly the right direction and the right distance to jump into the next door pool, and perhaps, again, off to safety. It's like a video game. It's pretty good, isn't it? I've been practicing. And these guys have been studied in their native environment. Scientists have taken these fish away, kept them in laboratory aquarium tanks for a few weeks, put them back where they found them, and they still jump in the same directions. They still remember this mental map that they've created in their minds of their environment, and they remember how to escape efficiently from these predators. So these guys definitely have more than a 3-second memory, and they're making really smart choices, which they need to survive in this particular environment. They've evolved to have this ability to memorize their spatial surroundings and to escape. So frill fin gobies are definitely one example of fish that have much more than a 3-second memory. And my other favorite example of a fish that demonstrates to us that there is an awful lot more going on than meets the eye with these fish and what they get up to is the cleaner wrasse. Now, if you've ever been lucky enough to visit a coral reef anywhere in the world, well, mostly actually in the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. If you're in the Caribbean, there are similar species that are gobies that will do a similar thing. But anyway, you will see these little fish. And again, this is a photo I took. And I should explain that, again, I'm not very good at taking pictures. Cleaner wrasse are particularly hard to take photos of because they're swimming really fast, basically darting around, trying to get a customer another fish that it will then clean. And I was actually taking the picture of this chap here and didn't realize that there was some cleaning going on in the background. So this is another fish with 2 cleaner wrasse, these little thin ones here. And they are basically the hygienists of the coral reefs. They're the dentists, the nurses that are looking after all the other fish and doing a really good job of picking off dead skin and parasites from any other fish that want to be cleaned. And that's basically all of them. Now, what's my next slide? So they will basically clean anything that comes along, any fish, big or small, that is needed. And actually, I need to click this video here. Anything on a reef, if it wants to be cleaned, that will work. So here is a human scuba diver. They really are programmed to do this. I've never had it done. I've never tried opening my mouth, but I've had my nails done by cleaner wrasse. They'll come along, just pick at the skin at the edge of your nails. You just have to go to their cleaning sites. They have these stations across the reef where they will defend a small territory, 1 or 2 little fish. And then if you show up, behave in the right way, basically just be big and look like you've got lots going on, they will come and clean you. And what they're after, in fact, is these guys, gnathiid isopods, little parasites. They're basically the ticks of the reef. They will swim up from the coral reef, latch onto a fish and suck their blood for about an hour at a time. Then they drop off. But fish really do like to have these picked off. They don't like to give off their blood that. So they visit a cleaner wrasse in order to have these things removed. And the wrasse will eat thousands of these a day. An individual wrasse is basically constantly eating parasites. But that is actually not what it would rather do. If it had its choice, if it had its way, a cleaner wrasse would rather eat something else. From its client fish. It would rather eat slime. Now, it sounds really disgusting, but when it comes to being a wrasse on the reef, one thing that's really important is not to get sunburnt. And fish have slime on the outside. Fish are slimy, but it's a very useful thing they have. It stops them from getting infections. And on coral reefs, it also contains a sunscreen. They obtain those molecules from their food, so they can't actually make the sunscreen themselves. But as a cleaner wrasse, what they can do is they can cheat. And instead of taking off parasites, they can take a mouthful of slime, and that way they actually use the sunscreen and it can go onto their own slime. And they benefit from that. The slime is also quite nutritious. But they know that they can only cheat and grab a mouthful of slime at certain times and when certain customers come to visit them. They get hundreds of fish that come to their cleaning sites every day, and they memorize each single one, and they tailor their services accordingly. And they ask themselves various questions. For example, is it a herbivore or a predator? And this is probably the most obvious thing they need to be careful about. If it's a nice, harmless herbivore like this, this is a sturgeon fish. They just eat seaweed, so aren't particularly dangerous to a little wrasse. The wrasse then knows that it can get away with a bit of cheating. And so occasionally what it will do is it will pick off the parasites, absolutely fine, it'll do a good job, but then it'll probably just, at the end of the service, it'll just take a bit of mouthful of slime. And the surgeonfish won't be happy, it'll flinch, it might swim off. So to try and stop that from happening, the wrasse apologizes. It actually says sorry by giving the fish a massage. It will rub over the fish with its fins and all over its body. And, I mean, you can look at the fish and see that it's clearly, the surgeonfish is clearly enjoying himself. They do look like they've been put into a trance. Science tells us actually that this is what's going on. Stress hormones in their blood tend to drop a bit, and they do seem to benefit. So there's even a theory that these other fish, as well as getting cleaned, they need to come and get cleaned, they may come to a cleaning station just because they like it, and it's nice. And there are some that just keep coming back. It's like, yeah, I've got one more. Can you just get that one there? So interesting things are going on. And, I mean, the wrasse know they can't cheat all the time as well, because if other fish are watching, they might get put off and swim somewhere else. So they will look how long the queue is. If there's a great big queue of fish waiting to be cleaned, they will clean very carefully and they won't cheat. But if there's only a couple of them left, doesn't matter, and they will cheat more frequently. And we know all of this from studies that people have done, watching these fish for hours, keeping them in aquariums, and seeing what they get up to. And it's all very, very different if it happens to be a really nasty predator, like a Moray Eel. And this is when the cleaning seems to be at its most extraordinary. These fish climb into the mouths of predators, and they've only got this ability to dance, to advertise their services by sort of swimming around and massaging and kind of saying sorry as well. So in fact, the wrasse won't say sorry to a predator, they'll just massage them anyway, because it calms them down. And they form this truce, so the predator won't eat them at the cleaning site. If it was anywhere else on the reef, it would be an instant, easy snack. But somehow they bear this truce. The wrasse behaves incredibly well, never cheats on a predator in order to stay alive. And they tailor these services in really wonderful, subtle ways. And all of this really, what it's showing us, it's not just showing us that fish are more intelligent than we think, or that we used to think, but also it's telling us about how intelligence evolved. Fish are, this 30,000 species of fish really are a wonderful experiment in evolution. And more scientists and ecologists are looking to fish to understand how things have evolved, because there are so many fish doing different things. And it's showing us that it isn't just about having a big brain, as previously we would have thought. It's all about mammals like ourselves evolving enormous brains, and we need them for the social, complex lives that we have. Fish have tiny brains. They do have very small brains for their body size, mostly. And yet, in some cases, they evolve complex behaviors that do seem to show us signs of higher intelligence. It isn't all about size. Lots of other things are going on. And the ecology of intelligence is something we're just starting to get more of an insight into, and trying to reframe this mainstream view of fish and their brain power. They really can outclass themselves and get up to stuff that no one really thought about before. So fish are much smarter than we think they are. Fish also, there's another myth about fish that I want to return to, and in particular, I'm going to go back to this lady we met at the beginning, Moray Fish, and tell you a little bit about the things that she got up to. She was interested in the sounds that fish make. And this is another myth. I mean, I remember being, when I was a kid, being read stories by my mum and dad with lots of animals in them. And when I knew all the animals, I knew all the sounds. I could do the cow and the sheep and the rabbit. No, the rabbit's a bit difficult. Okay, the cat and the dog. But when it came to a fish, in my storybooks, I never knew what sound to make. And it's long been assumed that fish don't make sounds because we don't hear them. Generally, those sounds don't come out of the ocean. And it's only recently that people like marine fish went to listen to fish and figure out that they do indeed make lots and lots of sounds. Now, this is the bit where I have to apologise. We've had a technical hitch, and I was going to play you some of the sounds that she recorded, but it's not working. So instead, you'll have to log onto the website, and I'll get the sound clips, and we'll put it into the podcast version of this presentation. I might just have to impersonate some of the fish that she discovered. But first of all, the story of why she was doing this is quite strange. So this was in the 1940s and 50s, at the end of the Second World War, and the US Navy were very interested in the sounds that fish make, because during that time, during the Second World War, a lot of underwater surveillance was going on, submarines were being used for the first time, hydrophones had been developed, and the navies were trying to listen out for each other. They were trying to use these recording devices to listen for the sounds of enemy ships, enemy subs, but quite a lot of the time they couldn't hear that because the creatures in the ocean were just too noisy. They really were the first to discover that the seas are incredibly noisy and that it comes down to, in large part, to fish. So the US Navy paid and supported the research of Dr. Fish for about 20 years to go out recording the sounds of fish, to try and understand more about where fish are noisiest, when they're noisiest, and what their voices sound like, so that they could tease apart this cacophony of sounds in the oceans and try and listen out better for what they want to hear, which are enemy warcraft and so on. So that's what she did. She drove around the coast of the US with a car decked out in recording equipment, and she lowered hydrophones into the rivers, and she caught fish and auditioned their voices in captivity and recorded all of these. And they're all available online, so I had downloaded a few of these for you to listen to. But just imagine the sounds of other creatures. Actually, fish do sound mostly like frogs croaking. Some of them hum and buzz, and they generally are quite incredibly vocal. These are some of the fish that you would have seen. And their names kind of do give it away. Some scientists who named these clearly knew that these ones do grunt a bit like frogs. These ones do croak. The sea robin, I'm not quite sure what that's called, a sea robin. It doesn't really sound like a bird, but anyway. And we now know that fish do make sounds for all sorts of reasons. If you've ever swum on a coral reef, you might have been attacked by one of these guys. Damselfish farm areas of the reef for seaweed, and they pick out varieties they don't want to eat, and so they're cultivating the tasty ones, and they're incredibly angry if anything comes close, including a human scuba diver, and they will swim at you and make this drumming sound at you to try and scare you away, even if you're really huge. They make sounds in various different ways. There's grunts, which are making a grunting sound, actually grinding their teeth together. A lot of fish have a second set of teeth at the back of their throats. It almost looks like they're trying to swallow a set of dentures. Usually this is for grinding food down, but they also use it for making sounds. So the grunt is using that to make it sounds. And there's a piece of equipment, a piece of anatomy that the fish have that they use to make lots of sounds, and that is the swim bladder. It's basically a gas-filled balloon that fish have originally evolved, possibly from lungs, actually. It's possible, we'll come back to lungs in a minute, but fish may have originally evolved lungs, and then secondarily it turned into basically a flotation device. It helps them stop them from sinking underwater. Sharks don't have swim bladders, so they do sink more and have to keep swimming if they don't want to sink. But they're also quite useful as a sound-making device. And again, I was going to show you a lovely video of a toadfish that has this amazing, deep, kind of croaky voice. And what he's doing is he's got a muscle on the outside of that swim bladder that vibrates and makes a wonderful humming, drumming sound. The triggerfish, which was the fellow we saw in that video earlier, they actually hit the outside of their swim bladder with their fins, like they are drumming. And this is the one that the kids always love me to tell them about when I do these talks, which are the herrings. So these balloons of gas inside the fish, there are two ways in which these are filled up with gas in different groups of fish. One group of fish has a gas gland stuck to the outside of the swim bladder, and basically gases dissolve out of the blood. That takes quite a long time. The other half have a connection directly through to their guts and through to their mouths. So if they want to fill their swim bladder up, they swim to the surface, take a mouthful of air, swallow it down into their gas bladder, into their swim bladder. It can also come out of the gas bladder that way, but not through their mouths. It does come out of their bottoms, and the scientists who named this did call it the fast repetitive tick. It is, here's the paper, it's what they called it. Because we think it happens at night time. It's herring and very small shoaling fish have this. And in captive conditions, we've seen that they let out these little streams of bubbles from the bottoms, and we think it's so that they can keep in contact and know where their shoal mates are, their schoolmates, in the dark. And if you keep them, if you put a lid on their tank so they can't get to the surface of the water to refill their gas bladders, then they slowly get quieter because their bladders collapse and they can't refill them again. So we think they are communicating with these bubbles coming out of their bums to coordinate their shoaling, which is pretty cool. So fish are definitely more sonic than we ever thought they were. Here's a page from the book that Moray Fish published. She published actually several books of fish sounds based on all of this research that she was doing, drawing pictograms of sort of spectrograms of the sounds of frequency against time, and just trying to kind of get to grips with the different shapes, sonic shapes that fish were making through the water. Now, these days, we're still interested in the sounds that fish make, but in a slightly different way. Moray Fish was trying to pick out individual voices and understand what particular fish do and why they make these sounds and how they make these sounds. Her books are full of the mechanisms of all the different ways that fish are making sounds, as well as ideas as to why they're doing it. I mean, fish do talk to each other, I should say. They're not just trying to scare off scuba divers. They are flirting with each other. Mating calls are often what they're doing, and they also shout at each other when they're fighting. Piranhas, we think, have got at least 3 different sounds they make at different stages of their fights, but at the beginning, in the middle, and then there's a different sound that the winner makes when he says, "I've won," and you get out of here. So they're pretty complex. But these days we're actually interested in the soundscape, the entire soundscape of the underwater world, not just individual voices. And increasingly scientists are going out and putting down recording devices and just seeing the sounds that are made in an ecosystem. And there's a lovely example of this from a few years ago in South Africa. They took a small device and went down 120 meters in a submarine, a little mini submarine, put this recorder in a cave and left it for several months just to record the sounds. And what they found was this immensely diverse soundscape of all sorts of fish voices going off at different times, a great, great diversity of sounds. But they also found, for the first time, that fish seem to use sound like any other resource in their ecosystem. So the same thing as they divide up the food and the physical space, they're actually dividing up the soundscape between them as well. And in particular at night. So here's a chart from that study showing the difference between the daytime, the diurnal sounds, and the nighttime sounds. And this is just basically the frequency and the rate, so the pitch and the sound that's coming out of these different fish, and the different species are different colours. And you can see that in the daytime, they're quite clustered together, so it is quite a cacophony during the day. But at nighttime, it spreads out. And they really think that what's going on is that at nighttime when they can't see each other, so sound is also useful when you can gesticulate and wave your fins and generally get the attention of the fish that you want to see you. In the dark, you can't do that. So the sounds really have to be distinct. You don't want to crash someone else's sound. So the fish, it seems, have divided up the soundscape between them and are making sure that they don't clash and sort of sing over each other and make these calls. And this is the first time we've had any evidence of fish doing this, so who knows what else might be out there. But more and more we're listening to the overall sounds. We're finding things like a dawn chorus and a dusk chorus of fish, at times when they're most active, and there's just a much noisier space in the oceans. And sound really is important, we think, for ecosystems. We're finding things like tiny little fish are able to hear, and they navigate that way. They're often on a coral reef again, for example, as they'll be born as little tiny larvae that will drift away from the reef. And when it's time for them to come back, they will listen and follow the sounds of a reef. So they're tuned into this important aspect of the ecosystem. And you might be wondering, well, the oceans are getting noisier. We do know that the background sounds in the oceans are increasing because of human activities, from shipping, from oil and gas exploration and that kind of thing. But we don't really know the effect this is going to have on fish. Most of the studies of noise pollution are focused on cetaceans, on whales and dolphins, which are equally much more so, in fact, very vocal creatures. There's various ideas of whales having to sing louder to hear each other and that kind of thing. Whether this is happening in fish yet, we don't know. But I would say there's every chance that the fish will be impacted by really noisy environments and by the background noise increasing in their worlds. If they're listening to each other like as sensitively as they seem to be, in this deep sea environment in particular, then who knows how they're going to adapt when it all just gets a bit noisy. So that's a big question that we still need to answer. So talking of questions, I am now going to answer a question that I'm often asked. Well, if you do decide to have a read of my book, you'll see there was a particular case when I was on the radio and I was asked this question, and I was kind of stumped for an answer. So in a way, chapter 2 of the book is the answer I should have given in really long form. When posed with the question, Helen, is it true that there's no such thing as a fish? Are we just making up this idea that there is a biologically rigorous definition of what fish are? Are such differing creatures as pufferfish and sunfish and basking sharks and flatfish, are they really, really all belonging to the same group of creatures that we can call fish? Or are they just a random collection of creatures that happen to be good at swimming? Are we just as much reason to group together spiders and octopuses because they have 8 legs? And certainly, if we look historically, there's been a real mishmash of ideas as what fish are. Going back to old books of beasts and things, there are fish bishops covered in scales. There are men with fish on their heads. There are lions covered in scales. There are mermaids, all sorts of beasts. But seriously, there really has been this long debate over what fish are. Initially, all of the creatures in the sea that were basically wet or in any kind of water were counted as fish. Then slowly, gradually, we've come to the idea that we can define fish as something separate. We're confused a bit now because there are creatures like jellyfish and starfish, which are not fish as we define them. Those are invertebrates. They don't have backbones. They are really on a different part of the animal family tree. But we can look at, and we can see that there is such a thing as fish. And we can do that partly from wonderful studies of anatomy and looking at these individual animals. We've now got also genetics, which shows us that they are all related to each other, these creatures. And I can show you a simplified version of the fish evolutionary tree. Again, this appears in the book, and this is what I wish I'd had in my mind when I was asked that question originally. And there's various interesting creatures, some we're familiar with, some are less familiar. And these are all of these are all the living species of groups of fish. They're not species, they're various different groups. There are other extinct ones that I could stick on top of this, but these are the living groups. And we can just get an idea for the flavour of the sorts of creatures that fish are with a very quick run up the fish family tree. Let's start at the bottom. With the ones that probably first evolved, or at least shared an ancestor with the rest of them the longest ago, the furthest back in the past, are the jawless fish. Creatures like this hagfish. There's several species of these guys, which are renowned mainly for making lots and lots of slime, as you can see in this picture. This is what happens when a huge 3-ton consignment of live hagfish, unfortunately, undergoes an accident on a highway in America. Hagfish are caught and used their slime is actually used as a cooking ingredient in Korea, apparently, in replacement of egg yolks, or egg whites, I think. Anyway, so they are caught and they are transported alive, and there was an accident last year, and this was the outcome. It is a predatory defense against predators. They produce this slime to basically put off other creatures that have just bitten them, and it's a very good way of persuading something to spit you back out again. So there's hagfish and there's lampreys, which are the jawless fish. They're really, we call them primitive fish, but really it means that they have an ancestor that we can trace the furthest back on the evolutionary tree of fish. Next up, we've got the sharks and rays. Hopefully quite familiar to you, basking sharks, whale sharks, manta rays, stingrays. But chimeras are a slightly weird cousin of sharks. Here's a little video of one of them. They live in the deep ocean. They're also called rat tails or elephant fish with that weird nose. So less is known about those guys, but they belong to the same group. They actually are the cartilaginous fish. They've replaced their bony skeletons with the stuff that your nose and your ears are made out of. I'm going to skip on up to the lungfish. Here is one particular lungfish called Grandad. He lived in captivity in Australia for 80 years. He died last year, I think. They can live for a very, very long time. There's about 5 or 6 species of lungfish live in fresh water, and they do have lungs. And now some of the latest research seems to suggest that fish did evolve lungs first, before the swim bladder. And these guys have that lung for times when there's no water around. And they actually burrow into the muddy riverbeds just before a drought or before the rains stop, and they will chew themselves a hole in the ground, into the mud, turn around, take a gulpful of air, climb back down into their burrows and fill it with slime. Slime is important in fish. It is a recurring theme. And that makes this sort of little capsule that then can stay put. And they can survive that way for 4 years in this state of basically sort of sleeping in a burrow before the rains return. And then they will climb back out and then try and find something to eat. And usually the first thing they find to eat is another lungfish. So that's pretty tough. So there we go. Those are the lungfish. I'm going to skip on up to the coelacanths. These fish are mostly well known today because we thought they were extinct. They're kind of misnomer for them as a living dinosaur. Up until the 1950s, there were no living examples of coelacanths, but loads of fossils. There used to be tons of them living all through the oceans and all around the world. And then a lady scientist found one in a fish market in South Africa. It was recently dead, and she knew that she'd seen something different. And because of that, we realized that there's actually now 2 species of coelacanth that live very deep down. That's why we hadn't really found them before. And sadly, they're now becoming rather threatened with extinction because of this idea of them being a living dinosaur and having survived so long, which is kind of not true. They just happen to be a species that's a group, 2 species that are hanging on when they used to have more diversity. But people think that maybe they can live forever if they eat one. So there is a bit of a roaring trade in coelacanth parts amongst those people who think that eating one of them will make you live a long time. Anyway, right, another group of fish that are not doing too well, unfortunately. We're going to skip up to the sturgeons. Here's one here. They are 27 species of sturgeon, I think, and about 25 of them are at risk of extinction, mainly because people like to eat their eggs as caviar. This is a beluga sturgeon, one of the most critically endangered, partly because of the trade. I mean, they can be absolutely huge, almost bigger than beluga whales, which they're named after. They live in rivers and seas across Asia, but they really aren't doing too well now. I think this was taken in the 1920s. It's one of those record breakers. There's about 1.2 tons of caviar inside a single female. Extraordinary. So you just don't see them anymore. Catching them for their eggs, as well as polluting their environment, putting up dams which stops their migration. So unfortunately, sturgeon aren't doing too well. Okay, I'm going to skip right to the top. I've missed a few out, but you can catch up on the details in the book if you want to find out. But the teleosts at the top of the fish family tree are the latest group to diverge. And they really are most of what we would call fish today. 96% of the species alive, of that 30,000, is a teleost of some sort. So all of these guys are. They've diversified enormously around the time that the dinosaurs went extinct. About 66 million years ago, we think there was possibly a shift that took place in the oceans, which led to the dominance of the teleosts, and they're doing incredibly well today. And this is really where we see these experiments, if you like, in evolution. So many of these species are evolving. They're doing lots of really interesting things. And I'm going to come back to one of those things they do just briefly after I've zipped back down to the middle of our fish family tree, and the reason why some people have a problem with the idea of there being such a thing as a fish. And our culprit is here. I don't know if any of you noticed that there's a little creature in the middle called a tetrapod. The problem being that that's essentially where all of the other vertebrates evolved from. So a lot of the tetrapods are extinct now. We don't have any of these guys around, which is why for ages people were hunting for the missing link between fish and amphibians. How did we make this link from the sea to land? And here's one of them. This is Tiktaalik, a reconstruction. Quite a late stage, we think. Darwin would have loved this, as well as a whole bunch of other fossils that we found, which show this wonderful gradation, this transition from a fish to a 4-legged creature, the tetrapod that lived on land. This guy's sort of in between and is using its fins to sort of scurry around on the shore, but he goes back to swim as well. And that really is the reason why there is a problem with the definition of fish, because all of these guys, birds, mammals, and us, all evolved along this tetrapod lineage. We are all tetrapods. We're all the 4-legged land creatures. And the reason this is why there's something of a problem, because some taxonomists, some evolutionary biologists say, well, we can't call all of these fish if we're going to just cut this one off. That's arbitrary and random. We can't just say, well, yeah, they're fish apart from these ones, because we don't call this lot of fish. But that's fine. Basically, we can say that this is not too much of a problem when it comes to talking about the names of things. There are far worse things that can happen. Worse things like the pachyderms. That was a term for the elephants, basically animals that are thick-skinned, so the elephants, the rhinos, and the hippos. But then when genetics came along and we could actually draw a family tree like this, it turns out that they're really not that related to each other. They're really scattered around. So if we wanted to have a group that was the pachyderms, we'd have to cut out all of the manatees and the hyraxes and all these other bits and pieces, and that's definitely out. We call this actually a polyphyletic situation. Fish are paraphyletic, but this is just a step too far. Generally, when a paraphyletic thing is discovered through genetics, we quietly just put those animals back where they belong, and we pretend that we never had pachyderms in the first place. So that's not good. But the fish really aren't that bad. It's one cut. All we have to really do is come to terms with the fact that we evolved, all the other vertebrates that live on land did evolve from fish, and the fish continued to evolve after we left into all of these other groups, including, most importantly, the teleosts. It wasn't that we evolved onto land and left them to it and they stayed the same. They've continued to evolve into all sorts of different species, and then we just happen to be nestled among them. The same problem happens for dinosaurs. The birds evolved from within the dinosaurs. So there are some purists who say, well, we have to call them non-avian dinosaurs, or we could call ourselves fish, whatever you want to do. But I'm definitely convinced now that there is such a thing as a fish, and we have a wonderful array of incredible diverse creatures that we can confidently say are the animals with backbones that live in the water, generally breathe through gills, and have limbs in the shape of fins. And I'm fine with that. That's now my definition. So, back to some of the interesting things that fish get up to, that none of the other vertebrates do. So, again, this brings me back to this idea of fish being an experiment in evolution. And there's some things that they do that nothing else does. And one of my favorites really is bioluminescence. The ability to make their own light is something that fish are incredibly good at, and they put it to all sorts of uses. This is a flashlight fish. It has glowing sacs under its eyes, which essentially act as headlights for it to see through the dark. One of the most famous, probably bioluminescent fish is the anglerfish. This is a really recent piece, a shot from a piece of footage that was taken off the coast of the Azores, 800 meters down in a little mini submarine again. And it's one of the first pieces of footage that actually shows the male anglerfish attached to a living female. So this is the female. The male is this tiny wee little thing here that latches onto the female. Actually, his tissues fuse with hers, and then he just spends the rest of his time sort of stuck to her and provides sperm when she needs to fertilize her eggs. And she has this bioluminescent lure at the front of her mouth, like a little fishing rod that dangles down, and it glows in the dark and attracts other fish and food to come in and see what it is, and then she will open her enormous mouth and eat them. So there it is, there's her lure. But yeah, they're pretty famous for these crazy parasitic males as well. We see bioluminescence evolving in fish many, many times. There's about 1,500 species of bioluminescent fish, and they evolved at least 30 times across the fish evolutionary tree. So here's another version of that tree, a much more detailed version than the one I just showed you. And you can see that the luminescence just popped up many, many times. It's just repeatedly happened in fish. It just seems to be something that is incredibly useful. And it makes sense, because a lot of these fish live in the dark, and making your own light is an incredibly useful thing to be able to do. They can use their lights to attract mates, to attract food, to see through the dark when otherwise it's really hard to see. And so that's down in, this is just a shot through pictures through the depths of the ocean. And the very deepest parts we call the midnight zone. So lower than 1,000 meters is where there's no sunlight at all. And it's permanently dark, apart from clever little fish that make their own light and put very good use to it. Slightly above that, we've got what we call the Twilight Zone, between 200 meters and 1,000 meters down. And this is where, during the day, the sunlight does reach, it does trickle down, but it's very blue light, all the other colors have been absorbed. And this leads us to another use that fish have of bioluminescence. And this guy is a fully grown shark. Most sharks are very big, but this one's a very little one, sits in the palm of your hand. The velvet belly lanternshark. And here is a shot of its belly in the dark. And what it has evolved is the ability to hide itself in this twilight zone. It lives in this region down to 1,000 meters. And it can hide itself in this region where there's nothing to hide behind. It's just open water. Now, to explain that a little bit, imagine if you walk out probably in about an hour from now when it's twilight, and if you looked up at the sky, it would be a beautiful dark blue colour, just like it would be if you were in the twilight zone in the ocean looking upwards. It's a blue, intense blue colour. Then, if something were to swim, or in your case, fly over your head, so a bird or a bat, you'd see a dark shadow, a dark silhouette ahead of you, above you. And that's exactly what happens in the twilight zone. So a fish swimming by underneath could look up and see other little fish swimming around, and it could say, aha, there's some food that I would like to chase after. So what the velvet belly lanternshark and lots of other fish are doing is that they are hiding their bellies by matching the light that's around them. Some of them have lights in lines across their bellies, like this, just to break up that silhouette so they look a bit less like fish. And the sharks themselves have an entirely blue glowing belly, so they match that blue light around them with the light that they create on their bellies. And essentially it's like a cloak of invisibility. They can hide themselves when there's nothing to hide behind, which is pretty awesome. How they do this, how bioluminescence works, well, generically we say it's a chemical reaction between molecules that we call luciferin, which is the substrate. There's actually lots of different molecules it could be, and an enzyme called luciferase, again, that's several different molecules, which is an oxidation reaction that releases light. And in around half of the fish, this is an innate reaction. They have genes that produce these molecules, and they control that themselves. And in the other half, they take bacteria into their bodies that have this reaction. So it's a symbiotic thing with bacteria. So half is bacteria, half of the fish are able to make their own light. And this has evolved many, many times. And this guy is, lady, I should say, it's another anglerfish, another female anglerfish called the Illuminated Net Devil. And she does something pretty amazing. She not only has a lure at the top of her head, in front of her mouth, to attract in food, and that's got bacteria living in it. So the bacteria are free living in the ocean, but they have an organ which encourages them to come and live inside them. And she has a beard which evolved separately, this chemical reaction. So she's doing both of the types of bioluminescence. And not only have fish evolved this many times amongst them all, but some of them have done it twice, which is kind of brilliant. And probably her beard is also attracting food, possibly attracting those males. I don't know if that's what's going on, but there we go. So fish are brilliant at glowing in the dark, and I should make it very clear that no other vertebrates do this. We do get glowing beetles, the fireflies, some other invertebrates glow in the dark, but no other vertebrates do it. The fish are the only ones that have evolved, and oh my gosh, have they, so many times, and so brilliant at using their glowing abilities, which is great. Now, it's not the only way that fish glow in the dark. And now I want to show you, I actually need a volunteer. I usually do this when I get a sea full of children put their hands up. But would anyone be prepared to come up and hold a few things for me to demonstrate? That's very kind. Would that be all right? So I'm going to need to switch the lights off in a minute, so you'll be very welcome to have a bit of a snooze as well. But bioluminescence isn't the only way that fish glow in the dark. There are some other wonderful things that happen too. And what I would like to do is if you could just hold up that for me briefly. Thank you very much. We're going to do this one at a time. Now, can we have the lights down, please? On stage, is that possible? Yeah, is that going off? That's about right. Well, at least we can get an idea. Can it get on any further? No? Maybe? Okay, let's just see. This is a normal white light I've got in my hand. And as you can see, there's not much going on this. Here we go, this picture that I've beautifully painted for you this evening. That's just a normal bike light. But what I have here is a torch that emits only ultraviolet light. And yeah, it's quite different. So this is a Moray Eel. Of course, you all recognize that from the picture, the cleaner Wrasse picture. And this is a stonefish here. Lovely. Should we try the next one? I've got 3 different ones to show. Let's do that one next. Is that okay? And let's get, that right. It's actually this way up. There we go. So this one again, just to show you not much going on when it's just white light, and I will show you with UV. Here's a nice green shark. There we go. And one last one. I could probably do this one myself, actually. This one is Ta-da! Seahorse. Thank you very much. I think can we have the lights up and a big round of applause for our lovely assistant. Thank you very much. So obviously those are just paintings that I did myself. Again, I'm just about as good at painting as I am taking pictures. But what this is fluorescence. So this isn't bioluminescence, this is fluorescence. The pigments, the paints I used to paint those pictures are similar to the pigments that we are finding now in lots of different species of fish. In fact, I want to just, no, actually, we'll explain how it works and I'll show you the pictures. So to get an idea of what's going on with fluorescence, we just first of all have to remember that the light that comes in the sunlight is made up of different wavelengths, from short wavelengths of blues and purples up to longer wavelengths of reds, and then there's other things that we can't see either side. And a fluorescent pigment is reacting with short wavelength light. I had ultraviolet. I've also been scuba diving at night with a blue torch, which also works really well. But here is ultraviolet light reacting with the fluorescent pigment. This excites electrons in that pigment, which then increase in energy and then instantly fall back down, and at the same time release a photon of light. But they've changed the wavelength of that light. So the incoming wavelength is a short one, so ultraviolet or maybe blue. And then what comes off of the fluorescent pigment is a longer wavelength, usually greens, yellows, or reds. So here are some pictures of actual fluorescent fish. Here's the shark at the top. There's moray eels, stonefish, flatfish, and so on. I think we've got something like, again, about, at least 1,000 species of fluorescent fish that we've discovered. And here's a seahorse. And this was all discovered by chance only about 10 years ago. We've known about bioluminescence for hundreds of years. The first scientists who went out and started digging fish out in trawl nets from deep underwater realized that a lot of them have lights. But this fluorescence is something you have to go out with a ultraviolet torch. And it just happened to be that someone was doing that on the beach in Torquay and looked at anemones. They also have fluorescent pigments in them, sea anemones, and saw that they were glowing green. And recently we've realised that fish do this too. Now the big question is why? And then we really only have theories. This is such a new discovery. We don't really have a full answer as to why so many fish are fluorescent. One idea is that it could be camouflage. So the stonefish, which are so brilliantly camouflaged, as we saw in that video I took, they generally live on coral reefs where there's lots of coral and also algae. The chlorophyll, the pigments that those seaweeds have, as well as the pigments of seaweed that lives inside coral, tiny symbiotic algae inside coral has chlorophyll, and that is a fluorescent pigment. So they will also glow in the same way. So it's possible that stonefish have evolved these pigments to hide themselves as camouflage. A very recent discovery suggests, literally just a couple of months ago, suggests that also stonefish could be using their fluorescence as a warning sign. We've discovered that they've got this nasty-looking spine that sticks out the side of their head with a locking mechanism that flicks it out. How no one noticed this until now, I don't know. Maybe they just didn't get too close to these. They are very poisonous, I should point that out. Stonefish are very deadly poisonous, painful things to step on. But they glow, these are fluorescent pigments in these spines. It could be to put off other predators, it could be a warning sign, it could even be to show off to a mate, we don't really know. So that's possibly what's going on. But communication could be really one of the explanations for fluorescence. And what we need to know is partly that basically red light is just not available in the deep sea. It's the first wavelength of light that's absorbed very quickly. So this is the depth down here, down to 300 meters or so, and blue light's the one that goes the deepest. That's why the oceans are blue. All the other colors are absorbed. So there just isn't any red light, or yellows and oranges and greens a little bit deeper, but really not much available. So a red pigment won't look red at that depth. You can't have a red object without red light to reflect off it. So maybe the fish are making this light where there isn't any. Now, I should also point out that this isn't as spectacular in nature as it is when you're swimming around like I was with a blue torch. And it did look like an amazing wonderland. The coral reef glows red and green, and you see these fish that you've never seen in these colors before. Obviously, fish don't have ultraviolet torches or blue light torches. They're using the natural light that's around them, the natural blue lights and UV lights that's in the water. So this is a subtle mechanism. But we do have evidence that it does seem to matter to fish, and that they are able to see this in each other. And this is an example of that. This is a little fish called the fairy wrasse, and we've seen in captivity that they're very angry fish, and if you put a mirror in front of it, it will think it's another fish of the same species, and it will try to attack it. Maybe not the fish with the biggest brains, but anyway, they think their reflection is another fish. They're very territorial. This is it under ultraviolet light, so they have these lovely red colorations. If you basically then fiddle with that mirror so that they can't see that red light. And this is under normal illumination, not under UV light, just under normal white light. If you put a film over the mirror so that they can't see the red, they don't get so angry anymore. Suddenly they don't care about their reflection. Which hints, not absolutely sure, but it hints that these patterns are telling them that's a fish that I need to worry about because it's a competitor, I need to scare it off. But without those patterns, without those fluorescent patterns, maybe it doesn't realize what's going on. It's very early days, we've only just recently discovered this, but it reveals that there's all sorts of things going on in the fish world that we just had no idea about, and we're still trying to figure out how they're talking and communicating, hiding from each other, and all sorts of other things. Now, the final thing I want to talk about, I've got a few more minutes left, is one of the most controversial questions when it comes to fish biology, and one that a lot of people I find are interested in knowing more about. And it's a question that comes up more and more. And it's linked to this idea of fish intelligence and fish cognition, which is, well, do fish feel pain? Because again, it was really long assumed, a bit like the 3-second memory thing, assumed that fish don't feel pain. It's very hard to gauge. They're not creatures that we can really empathize with. They don't have facial expressions. They don't make sounds that we can really appreciate as backing up an idea of, ow, that hurts, or whatever. But evidence is stacking up now to show that probably fish do, certainly they can sense pain. It was in 2003 that researchers up in Edinburgh at the Roslin Institute found that rainbow trout have got the same neural. They're basically wired up in the same way with their nerves as we are to detect pain. They have the same detection systems going on. What's trickier to prove is how fish interpret those signals. So they can pick up a signal that this is something painful, this is something that's not very nice. In this case, they were doing things like injecting their lips with bee venom and with vinegar. And we're finding that the same neural pathways are there to detect that nasty stimulus. But more and more are actually finding behavioural evidence that they do seem to have an emotional response to that pain. Again, examples, I mean, it's not very nice, but trying to basically put fish in potentially painful situations and watching what they do. One example, again, with rainbow trout is that normally they will respond to alarm chemicals in the water that's released by another fish that's got tissue that's damaged. Their tissue is damaged if they're bitten by something, it releases chemicals into the water and the other fish will react to that and will try and hide because it's a sign of something around is going to attack you, you need to get out of the way. But if you inject, and people have, if you inject their lips again with bee venom and with vinegar, they seem distracted by that pain and they no longer hide. And this is something, it's a test that we have. If you've got something going on and it's a painful situation, you don't necessarily react the same way you would normally to a dangerous situation. So this does seem to be happening in the fish. And this is really no surprise at all to biologists to understand that it makes sense for pain to evolve hand in hand with an emotional response to it. What point is there trying to remove yourself from a dangerous situation if you don't really feel that pain? This is how we survive. We learn to associate painful situations with this nasty response we don't want to happen again, and so we avoid that and we survive better. It's evolved in us, so why would it not evolve in fish as well? This could be the key driver for forming memories. Ow, that hurt. I remember that. It was emotional pain. I'm not going to do it again. It's a really important survival tactic. But, well, so yes, there's a few more other examples actually of why we think that fish probably do have this ability to suffer. Do they get stressed is another question. We've got evidence from these guys. These are zebrafish, which are one of the little fish species that grow very well in captivity, and there's lots of studies are done on them. And they've been shown to undergo what we call an emotional fever. Now, I suspect there's an awful lot of emotional fevers going on right now in Cambridge, because if you had a stressed student who's got their exams, some of them will actually have the same physiological response to being infested by a pathogen. Your body temperature goes up. You actually look like you react as if you've been infected by something just because of stress. And you can stress out a zebrafish, and people have done this by confining them in a little net in a tank, and their body temperature goes up, just simply by stressing them out and not letting them move where they want to. So we do think there is evidence that they do feel stress. Another really good example is salmon in fish farms. We have a thing called dropouts. So about a quarter of most farmed fish are dropouts. They don't want to eat their food. They float at the surface. They basically aren't healthy and fit. It almost feels like they have become depressed. Trying to unpick this is still quite a tricky thing, but it seems that they do have high levels of cortisol, a hormone in their blood that's associated with stress. And overactivity of cortisol productivity is something that we see in chronic stress in humans. So it's possible that fish in these cramped, stressful conditions are suffering as well from symptoms of depression. Now, the reason mainly why we still have to push against this idea of fish feeling pain is that there are a group of scientists and various people who contend that the fish brain just isn't set up for detecting and processing pain. They don't have the same bit of their brains that we do that may be associated with that. And this is the neocortex. The outer layer of our lovely big human brain, the grey matter on the outside, is the neocortex. Fish, if you look inside a fish brain, which is up here, they don't have that bit. And there are plenty of people who argue that that is enough to tell us that fish can't detect and feel an emotional response to pain. And they're making the assumption that the only way to feel pain is the human way, and that you have to have a neocortex in order to be able to do that. Now, this is very controversial and is definitely not decided, and there are lots of very hot debates still going on between the fish pro-pain and anti-pain sides of this. And all sorts of evidence is stacking up more and more in favour, really, of the pro-pain, of the fact that fish probably do feel pain. And again, it's this idea of an evolutionary experiment. So fish aren't related to us. That doesn't mean that they haven't evolved to respond to pain in the same way that we do. Maybe their brains are small, but they could have evolved other parts of their brain to respond in this really useful and important way to painful, dangerous situations. Maybe other parts of their brain evolved to do that. And even if you look really carefully at the literature, it's not even that clear that our neocortex is absolutely the part of our brains that makes us feel pain. There's an association, but it's not that clear-cut that it's it's not that sure that it's definitely that part of our brains that does it. So it's all open for debate. I do think the reason partly why this is so difficult is there's so much riding on this issue of fish pain. Really, we're still treating fish ethically they're really lagging behind other mammals in the way that we treat them, the way we rear them, the way they're caught. Just imagine how the fishing industry would have to change if we were treating fish the same way we're treating other animals that are in our care. They are really lagging behind. There's various bits of legislation that have been in place since the early 19th century to look after cattle and sheep and so on, and we've stopped doing bear baiting and cockfighting, but fish are really lagging behind. There's a few examples of things slowly coming up, trying to look after fish a bit more. You do have to have a license as a scientist if you want to study fish, and you have certain guidelines to look after them. You have to look after your pet fish. A man in 2017, last year, was actually sent to jail for about 18 weeks after he posted a video of himself on Facebook allegedly eating a live goldfish. And the RSPCA saw this, and he was convicted of cruelty to animals. You're not allowed to do that. He claimed he didn't think it was alive still, but anyway. So there are some things in place, and really interestingly, I find there's some legislation in Germany and in Switzerland which says that if you are a recreational fisher, if you like to catch fish just for fun, you can't throw those fish back. You have to take them home and eat them, because otherwise they consider that to be an unnecessary source of stress on the fish, because it isn't nice for them. So actually, that's very different from other places where it's seen as a conservation tool, and actually letting a fish go is a good thing. So it's a mixed picture. We don't have a clear idea of how we should treat fish and what we should do them do with them in our lives. But there are millions and trillions of fish that we eat every year that are being caught, that are being kept as pets. And I think we really should spend more time thinking about what we are learning about how they're thinking, how they've evolved, all these amazing abilities down beneath the waves. And I genuinely think it's going to be a very long time before legislation catches up and fish are treated like any of the other vertebrates. But I think there's other things we can do. We can, all of us, pay more attention to fish and the science and the studies that are going on, revealing amazing things about their lives. And we can pay attention to that, and we can ask questions about the fish that we eat and the fish that we keep as pets. And, and just understand more about how we're affecting their lives, whether that's as individual animals, as whole populations, or indeed as in whole species. And we'll see how long it takes for us to really change our ideas about fish. So there we go. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Well, Helen, thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. Normal rules apply, ladies and gentlemen. Try and catch my eye. If I like the look of you, I'll bring you in to ask your question. Gentleman down at the front here, and then gentleman up at the side there.
In evolutionary terms, which is the oldest species and just how far back does it go?
So, fish have been around, the first animals that we would include if I put all the extinct groups back on that diagram I showed you. They first evolved in the Devonian, really, maybe the end of the Ordovician, so around about 500 million years ago. So very early on, we had little creatures that are interpreted as being the earliest fish, things like, really just little things with backbones, all the precursors of a backbone, little tiny creatures. Fish like proper big, recognisable fish were really big in the Devonian. So just up until that point were various other things going on. But they were a very early split in the animal kind of evolutionary tree between the vertebrates and the invertebrates. And we're still looking for the ancestor of the jawless fish, of the hagfish, and the lampreys, trying to figure out when that ancestor was around, and that would be the date we're looking for. And we're not quite sure yet. We're sort of looking around 550 million years, something like that, 550 million years.
Look at the side by the wall, about 3/4 of the way up on the left-hand side, yeah.
You have fish that swim around in daylight and hide at night, and others that come out at night. Is there any difference in their eyes, and are any of them colourblind?
That's a great question. So we have lots of diurnal fish and nocturnal fish, and you get a changeover. The day-on ones tend to go and have a sleep, and then the nighttime ones come out. The fish vision at night. Fish are generally they have colour vision. They have potentially better colour vision than us. Some of them see UV light and have different pigments. We have 3 photopigments that allow us to see the visible spectrum. Some fish have 4, some have 2. So some are probably monochromatic. The sharks, we think possibly are monochromatic. I don't know, actually, between the day and night. It's a very good question. I'm going to deflect that by giving you another example of something really cool that happens in fish vision, so it's not really answering your question, sorry. But we do know that migratory fish change their vision during their lifetime. So salmon, for example, spend a lot of their life growing up in the oceans, and they migrate back to the fresh waters to spawn. And when they're out in the oceans, their photopigments are very much tuned towards blue light, because there's a lot of blue in the oceans. And then as they migrate up into the rivers, they have an enzyme that actually changes the photopigment, a version of vitamin A in their eyes, so that they become more sensitive to red light, and actually far red light, because there's more of that available. It's in the murky, muddy waters inland, there's much more red. So they basically shift their vision towards red as they migrate. So I'm sorry I didn't answer your day-night question, but I hope that helps.
So a gentleman there, and then a lady in the middle there, and then a lady in the red down here.
You've got all these fluorescent fish that you showed us. Is it known whether the fluorophores in those are like protein-based, like green fluorescent protein, or?
So So green fluorescent protein is a really cool one. So that is a mixture of fluorescence and bioluminescence in a jellyfish. So it's two proteins. Well, the green fluorescent protein is the fluorescent one. They're actually bioluminescent as well. I said that fish don't swim around with torches. Jellyfish do. They have a bioluminescent ability to make their own light. Then the GFP gene, GFP protein, converts that blue light to green light. So they kind of do a bit of both. Are they proteins? Gosh, I'm trying to think. Brain has gone blank. Do we know what they are? The fluorescent. They are proteins. Yes, they're proteins. Sorry, it's catching up with me. Yes, we don't know an awful lot about them. I don't think they've been very heavily studied. It is a very new thing in fish, but I do think they are. Yes, I think they are proteins. Correct me. I will correct myself if I'm wrong on that, but I think they are. So far, I don't think we've found any fish that do both bioluminescence and fluorescence like the jellyfish do, which would be really cool. And if you don't know GFP, it's this gene that's now an incredibly powerful tool in all sorts of molecular studies because you can tag them onto genes and show where genes are being activated. And it all came from a jellyfish, so hooray for that. Thank you for that great question. Sorry not to be too sure on that either. Right, hopefully I can get the next one.
Can you tell us whether all fish have scales? Is that part of the definition of what a fish is? And can you tell us anything about scales?
Do fish have scales? And I should know more about scales, really, given my name. Lots of fish do, and they have lots of different types. There's different groups of fish scales that have evolved in different ways, mainly based on their shape. They keep growing throughout their lives, and scales can be used to age a fish, a bit like growth rings in a tree. But they're in lots of different types of structures. And so sharks, for example, have very different types of scales. They actually it's more based on their teeth. It's almost an adapted tooth that they have called denticles, which make them very drag resistant so that it cuts down eddies across their skin so they can swim very efficiently. Mostly for fish, the scale is a way of having a tough outer layer that's flexible. So mostly it's for protection and so that they can flex their bodies but still have this protective layer against things biting them. But then if we look at things like sturgeon, their scales are a bit different as well. Some of the other fish I skipped over in that fish evolutionary tree, we've got gars, which have these big shiny cycloid scales, which were very tough and were used apparently by traditional Native Americans to make body armor out of because they were that tough, great big things. So I think there's about 5 different types of scales that you see across the fish group that kind of come and go, and sharks definitely do things differently as well. So, and some of them lose their scales altogether. So there are definitely fish that don't have scales as such. So a seahorse, for example, has evolved its scales into what's really more like a boxy outer covering. And they have their backbone still inside, but they have almost more like a carapace on the outside, almost like a shrimp. And there are some fish that have lost. A lot of the deep sea fish have not bothered with their scales, and they're just soft and squishy, and they've stopped making them. So it's one of the characters in fish that sort of are quite flexible, that kind of come and go depending on the ecology of where that fish is living and what it's adapting to. So, thank you.
Lady down here, and then a gentleman over there, and then a gentleman up at the back.
You mentioned ways that fish are similar to what we see on land, so communicating through sound and migration. And I think you also mentioned a lungfish that buries itself in a hole for, I think you said 4 years. Is it hibernating in the way I would think of a bear hibernating? And are there fish that hibernate?
So hibernation, I think, it's when the metabolic rate goes down, doesn't it? And there's really a kind of slowdown of chemical reactions in the body. There are fish that sort of hibernate. There are ones that really do. I think the lungfish are just kind of surviving, and they aren't using much energy. And I don't know if it counts as hibernation in lungfish. It sort of counts as hibernation more so in fish in the Antarctic that basically hibernate through the long, cold, dark winters. So Antarctic cod will basically become incredibly inactive. I think it's more akin to denning in bears, when they will sort of periodically wake up and try and find some food and then go back to sleep. But their metabolic rates do fall. I think that's just better studied in the Antarctic somehow. And mainly it's because they can't see. The temperature of the sea actually doesn't change that much down in the Antarctic. It's always cold. And they have antifreeze in their blood, which was also discovered reasonably recently, that stops them from turning into a block of ice. But because it's dark, during the winter. They can't find their food, and they haven't evolved bioluminescence, so they just go to sleep.
How much is known about the natural lifespan of small ocean fish?
Of small ocean fish. Generally shorter. I think things like anchovies and herring won't have a particularly long lifespan. Their turnover will be faster to maturity, and then they won't live so long as well. So I would say in a handful of years, I would think maybe up to 5 years or so. Sharks tend to be the longer lived. Their general strategies for sharks compared to many of the other fish is long, slow lives, taking years. I mean, it could be 150 years for a Greenland shark to start reproducing. It's a ridiculously long time. Whereas the bony fish, the rest of the fish, generally it's a faster paced thing, reach maturity quicker, reproduce, scatter lots and lots of eggs into the ocean usually, and life is much more fast paced. But I would say in sort of 1 to 5 years. Seahorses are sort of maybe 10 years, we think, something like that. Who's next?
So there's been, as I understand it, evidence of cross-species cooperation in fish, and interestingly between fish and non-fish. So for example, moray eels and reef groupers, or prawn gobies and shrimp. And so I was just wondering if there have been any studies into the level of communication, if any, between fish and other species of fish, or fish and non-fish.
It's a really lovely example, yeah, and I do write about that in my book, because it was scientists in Cambridge who did the studies of groupers and realised that they have this ability to communicate to other predators, to help them hunting, basically, because they're such big fish, these chunky big fish can't swim into the reef. If a little fish swims off out of reach, it can't go after it. So actually it grabs the attention of a moray eel, one of these long thin ones, or sometimes octopuses, and then another species of fish that have jaws that fling forwards and can reach into the reef. And they basically seem to have evolved a gesturing language of pointing. And that's the first time that had ever been seen in fish. So I think this is the kind of the cutting edge of interspecies communication with fish, is this example from reefs of groupers. Essentially, they will swim over to a moray eel and shake their head and kind of wake them up. And the moray eel will say, okay, all right, and it will swim off with the grouper, and they will go to this site, and the grouper will point its head at the place where the fish is hiding, and the little eel will slide in. And either the eel will catch that fish, or it will chase it out, and the grouper gets it. And these guys will go hunting together for an afternoon, and on the whole, they'll both get some food, and it's a good strategy for them to go together, a pretty dangerous team. So I don't know if we have any other examples of this kind of interspecies communication. It's a really important part of the story of fish do show signs of higher intelligence that we have, more so than we ever really thought before. But it takes people like these guys from Cambridge who spent hundreds of hours in the water watching. In fact, they were studying cleaner wrasse when they first noticed this, and they were in the water so much, and they were like, we keep seeing this grouper doing this weird head shaky thing. Let's go and see what they're doing. We need more people doing that to kind of unfold these hidden behaviours in fish. And I don't think we have any other examples of that, but it shows the sorts of things that you don't expect to see in fish, maybe in mammals and birds, but fish aren't supposed to be that nuanced, but they are. So thanks for bringing that up. I'm sorry I can't add to that, but it is a lovely example of the unexpected behaviours of fish that we're still really uncovering.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back there, and then a gentleman down here, and that'll have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
What about electrical emissions and sensing? The fish that are good at that, do they also get into the bioluminescence, or is it one set or the other?
So electro-sensing and electro-detecting and production are two other things that I could happily have given you as wonderful examples of things that fish do that really nothing else does. Again, a great evolutionary experiment. So there are electric eels, which are pretty famous, that produce very high voltages to hunt with, but there are also much more, I think, subtle and lovely things called elephant fish, different to the chimeras, but little freshwater fish, that essentially use electricity like a bat uses sound. They produce very weak electric fields that emanate from their snouts, from this long snout at the front, and it produces a field around them. and they can detect that field along their bodies, and if there's changes to it because an object is in its way, changes the field, it knows that it's there. And so there are other ways in which different fish detect electric fields. So sharks have got electric sensors on their snouts, and we think that's involved in navigation and so on. So these are all different things. The electroproduction, again, has evolved about, I think about 12 times individually in fish. They keep doing it like bioluminescence, but it isn't strictly related to bioluminescence. I think it's just another example of something that fish seem to repeatedly evolve. This convergent evolution seems to keep happening. And in fact, with the exact same genes keep getting tweaked in the same way to produce the ability to produce electricity. You see them in very different parts of the fish evolutionary tree are tweaking the same genes. So evolution within tight constraints can actually repeat itself. So fish really are teaching us about how evolution happens and how it works.
Last one.
Your first slide showed the depths which different fish are, down to 1,000 metres. How do they structurally differentiate or differ to cope with the pressures? Because in the Attenborough's films, some of these fish are quite small, it's not the huge ones, might be better able to absorb the pressure.
So how do different fish withstand pressure? It's a really interesting thing, especially the ones that move up and down. They're the ones that have to adapt really quickly. So, for example, the swim bladder is the most difficult thing to deal with because if a fish has adapted to a certain pressure and filled up its gas bladder with one of those glands, if it then swims upwards, that gas is going to expand because the pressure is released. And it's generally why if you fish up some of these fish that have a gland-based swim bladder from deep down and you yank them straight up, their swim bladders pop, and that's not very good. If they have this one that's connected through to their guts, they can adapt more quickly and let some of that gas out, and so they can adapt a bit more. But there are fish that will migrate naturally to feed in shallower waters during the nighttime, and then they come back down. In fact, we have this mass migration of possibly the most numerous vertebrates on the planet, these little things called lanternfish, there's trillions of them, and every night they rise up to feed in the shallow waters and then go back down. So they're fine with that pressure change. Presumably they can change their swim bladders. They may even not have a swim bladder. Some fish don't have them. But when we get really, really deep down, so we're talking fish down at the bottom of the Mariana Trench deep, like 11 kilometers down, then the problem isn't so much the swim bladder, it's actually your enzymes working and your cells being able to function at these extreme pressures. We're talking about the same pressure as, I think, 17 people standing on each other's shoulders, and the one at the bottom is wearing stiletto heels, and that's the pressure on every single square inch of your body. Then it comes down to molecular changes within the cells so that proteins can still work and enzymes can still work. This TMA, trimethylamine, is a molecule that fish have, and more of them, they have a higher concentration the deeper they are, and we think that's partly to keep their cells working the deeper down they are. And it's the stuff that makes them smell fishy as well. So I think deep sea fish are probably very smelly. So they have lots of adaptations to persist at that sort of depth, because there's no way anything that's adapted to the shallow could just go down and keep functioning at such extreme depths. But they'll stay down there, they won't come back up, they'll just stay put.
By the looks of some of them, I hope they do stay there. I'm sorry I haven't let a number of people come in. We've just run out of time. I think it's a measure of how fascinating this has been, Helen, all the way from the history of creatures right up to the latest research with a good slug of slime on the way. I mean, it's been absolutely enchanting and colourful and most engaging. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.